Please make sure to mute yourself, guys. Okay, so if you guys want, you can take a selfie of yourselves enjoying the talk and send it into Alexandra Fermanek, a BSc student who is putting together a collection of images for the BSc newsletter. As well, now I'll pass it on to Carl, who will be moderating this talk.
All right, thank you very much for that, Celine. Very good evening, everybody. My name is Carl, and I am one of the 6 Sen Club subcommittee members for this year, and I will be your host for tonight. Today, November the 3rd, is a very, very special day in the sense that it is both the US election day and the 87th birthday of Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize laureate that our club is named after. So please join us in wishing him a happy birthday, although he couldn't make it here to join us tonight. Professor Sen is very well known for his contribution in welfare economics and social justice theory, which are highly debated topics in this year's American presidential election as well, which happens to be our topic for today. So speaking of elections, we conducted this short poll before the start of today's talk, and we've got 45 votes on that. We basically asked your opinions on this year's presidential outcomes, and let me share the results now. Yeah, so according to the Economist forecast, Joe Biden has a 95% chance of winning the election. However, you guys indicated your own judgments. While the majority of you guys still voted for Biden, a surprising 27% of you believe Donald Trump would go on to win re-election. It seems like there's this sense of disbelief in the polls among some of you, and indeed, you might be right, as polls are not always accurate reflections of reality. And that is the reason why we have invited Dr. James Abdey from the statistics faculty to join us and discuss the science of political polling and its biases. It is a great honor for us to have Dr. Abdey in the house tonight. Apart from being an outstanding statistician, Dr. Abdey has also worked on various quantitative-based consultancy projects in areas including the art market, and has also given seminars in the UK Parliament. I happen to have the chance to attend Dr. Abdey's vibrant and enjoyable ST102 lectures for the last year, and I can assure every one of you that today's talk is going to be an absolute treat. So just before we kick off today's talk, I would just like to share a few points of notice. Today's talk will consist of 50 minutes of speech from Dr. Abdey and 10 minutes of Q&A in the end. It is very nice to see so many of you joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Abdey, for promoting your talk and your lectures. We would like to inform you that, like what Celine has said, the session is recorded. But you guys are very, very welcome to keep your cameras on, just so that we can all see you. Yeah, that should be pretty much for me. And without further ado, I shall hand over the mic to Dr. Abdey to begin today's talk.
Thank you very much, Carl and Celine, for that very warm introduction. Indeed, Celine, as president, of course, we are talking about another kind of president with regards to this talk. And every 4 years, the US electors head to the polls to decide who they wish to be their head of state. Now, I'm delighted to have been, to return to give a Sen Club lecture. I gave one actually about 4 years ago in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election race. And no matter where you are or where you were in the world at the time, I suspect most people were somewhat surprised by the result. The question, though, is, should we have been surprised by that result? So I see quite a large attendance in attendance for this evening's lecture. There were some results. Let me just perhaps share these results on the screen. I'm not sure what you can see. But in terms of, we asked you who you thought was going to win the election. And there was, you can see it. So 27% of you declared Donald Trump will be the victor, 71% for Joe Biden. And let's hear it for those third-party candidates. Lest we forget, it is not just Joe Biden and Donald Trump standing for the presidency. There are, I was reading somewhere, hundreds of third-party candidates, and 2% support for that. Interestingly, with regards to turnout, I think a very important factor with regards to the 2020 presidential race, I see there were, 40 5 respondents to that particular poll. And at the time that poll was conducted, there were 60 participants in this meeting. So clearly, the fact you decided to voluntarily sign up for this meeting, and it was a very easy poll to participate in. Just click a button on screen about which option or who you felt was going to win. Yet even with a very engaged audience, and dare I say a very educated audience, which you are, 45 out of 60 at the time the poll was conducted, that's just a sort of turnout rate of 75%. So turnout, a feature we will be looking at in this evening's lecture, but interesting that even with a very engaged group of students attending this meeting, there was not 100% response to this very simple poll question. Now, for undergraduates on the call, clearly you will know me from SD 102. So first year students, hope you are settling well, either in person or face-to-face, mask-to-mask, or if you're studying remotely. Second year students, I hope you enjoyed SD 102 last year. Carl and I were reminiscing on the last academic session. And in particular for first and second year undergraduates, one thing you will not have covered yet, but I suspect third year undergraduates and any postgraduates tuning in this evening, is something called logistic regression. We did not cover that in SD 102, but in econometrics, so EC 220, EC 221, likely you will study logistic regression, where your dependent variable is categorical, namely e.g. Whether you're going to vote for one specific candidate or another in an election. Now, what I'd like to do is begin, if I may, with a short video. So let's clear that, and all being well, we should be able to play a short video clip.
I mean, those polls were so wrong. Those polls were wrong on just about everything.
The 2016 U.S. election polls got it all wrong, didn't they? Well, not quite. The national polls were actually pretty accurate. They showed Hillary Clinton ahead by around 3% on average. And she did win the popular vote by a margin of just over 2%, so pretty close to the polling. But in America, that's not what wins you the presidency. Donald Trump won in more key states and ultimately walked into the White House. So can we trust the polls to predict the winner in 2020?
If you want to trust them to predict the winner in a razor-thin election, that's a mistake. Polls, even the best ones, are really not up to that task. Polls are a snapshot in time about what the public is thinking or feeling at a particular moment when we collect the data.
So how does polling work? Specialist polling groups, news organizations, and some universities carry out polls over the phone, online, or a combination of these methods. Election polls ask people a variety of questions, but the main one is, if the election was held today, who would you vote for? The number of people taking part varies from poll to poll, but for election polls to be accurate, they need to survey a representative sample of likely voters. But that can be hard to do.
To do polling in the US well, you have to recognize that some groups are more likely to take polls than others. Older folks, whites, and college graduates. And so you have to statistically weight down the college graduates so they're proportional to what they are in the population.
Underrepresenting people without college degrees is what some state polls did in 2016, which meant there were some surprise wins for Trump.
It's the upper Midwest. It's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin were the states that were the shockers. They used to be known as the blue wall for Democratic candidates because they were just consistently, cycle after cycle, would support the Democrat for president.
Using polling data to predict the final result doesn't account for voters being influenced by the candidates' campaigns.
There was a real late swing in Donald Trump's favor among the 10 to 15% of voters who waited until the last days to make up their mind. Getting it right means people accurately predicting their own future behavior about whether they're going to vote and whom they're going to vote for. And even if the pollster does everything perfectly, they can change their minds, especially in the long campaigns that we have in the US, a lot can happen.
This year, more voters than normal say they've made up their minds, but there's still uncertainty due to the pandemic and a big increase in postal voting. So while polls can be trusted to provide a good guide to the public mood at a given time, they shouldn't be relied on to predict the final outcome.
Okay, so hopefully you were able to hear and see that video clip quite clearly. And I think that reality check report from the BBC nicely encapsulates the central problem of polling about how to ensure a representative sample. And indeed, we had a title for tonight's talk of Redemption of the Pollsters. Well, I suppose there should be a question mark at the end of that because at time of speaking, we don't yet know what the result is. The polls are clearly very leaning very heavily towards a Biden win, but clearly there was quite considerable confidence that Hillary Clinton was going to prevail back in 2016. Now, as economics degree students and I think a few honorary Sen Club members here tonight, when you study a statistics course, be it mine in ST 102, or indeed progressing to econometrics and EC 220, EC 221, we are fairly cavalier and generalistic to say, oh, we take a random sample from a population and conduct some statistical inference. You know, we do a t-test, we run a regression. However, we often neglect the issue of trying to ensure a sample is sufficiently representative. Now, I am just going to share my screen again. Okay, so we saw with regards to the opening poll, 27% of you thought Donald Trump would win and 71% for Joe Biden. And let's hear it for those third-party candidates, 2% support for that, although that just reflected one particular respondent. If you were looking carefully at the polling question, it said that The Economist had indicated a 95% probability that Joe Biden would win. That was factually correct that when I wrote that particular polling question. We can see that the latest figures from The Economist, just updated 10 hours ago, we see that probability has now increased a little bit more to 97%. Now, one needs to be careful here about what we should be looking at. Is it the number of votes? Well, the electoral system in the US, it's not just about winning the popular vote, rather it's winning enough votes in the right places. So The Economist for some time has been collating lots of polling data, and they've created their own prediction model. Now, if we look first of all, at the chance of winning the most votes. I don't think we will be that surprised if Joe Biden ends up, if not by tomorrow, because there's still many mail-in ballots to count, and it may not be immediately, or the final results may not be known for some time. But I don't think anyone's going to be too surprised if Joe Biden does walk away with winning the popular vote, as Hillary Clinton did back in 2016. Of course, that in itself does not win you the presidency. Rather, you have to win sufficient states, and each state has a certain number of electoral college votes, roughly sort of proportional to the size of the population of that state. Now, by way of comparison, 4 years ago, on the eve of poll back in 2016, of course, then it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. In that race, Clinton on eve of poll, the implied probability that Clinton would win, based on the prediction markets at the time, where people were sort of betting their own money on what they thought the outcome would be, was 75%. And although there would have been third-party candidates in 2016, clearly it's a sort of binary race. There are only two credible winners, the Democrat candidate and the Republican candidate. So as it had to be one or the other, Clinton and Trump were mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive of the viable winners in 2016. So Clinton on the 75% and Trump on 25%, sort of on the eve of poll. So fast forward now to 2020, going into the election, clearly this prediction model is far more confident that Joe Biden is going to win the Electoral College, and it's this that you need to win, this column, not this one, for winning the White House. Now, 97% is a very high probability, but it's not 100%, so there is uncertainty. Interestingly, again, the figures of you, let me just clear those annotations, your predictions, the split was 71% for Biden and 27% for Donald Trump. Mutually exclusive, not collectively exhaustive, because we had the 2% for the third-party candidates. I think a third-party candidate winning is highly improbable. The probability of an electoral college tie is less than 1%. So numerically, 538 electoral college votes up for grabs. In order to win the presidency, you just need more than the other candidate, so you need 270 to win. So of course it is possible that each candidate ends up with 269, they add up to the 538, such that there is no overall winner. Not impossible, an event with a less than 1% probability is highly improbable, but it's not impossible. Now, on what basis have they come up with this figure of 97%? Well, clearly based on polling data, and there's lots of exciting things here. I'm going to jump down actually some of those, the most recent opinion polls. So, and to relate this back to like ST 102, econometric studies, exam questions typically start off with a random sample of size n is drawn from some distribution, and then we've got this data and perform our regression ANOVA, t-test, whatever it may be. But we really do need to be mindful about just how representative a sample is. And as that video clip attested, it's easier said than done. So on screen, you will see the most recent polls that have been conducted. Note the pollsters, many of these well-respected names in opinion research, YouGov, commissioned by or on behalf of The Economist, Ipsos, well-known market research organizations. These were the most recent polls, and I want to focus on the different criteria which we could use to judge whether we should trust the polls or not. So each of these opinion polls tended to last at about 2 or 3 days. So if we compare this one over October the 29th to 31st to the most recent one, October the 31st to November the 2nd, people can change their mind. However, a key difference between 2020 versus 2016 is that in 2016, there were more undecided voters. So there are the partisan split between the Democrats and Republicans, but the like the independent voters, those who were unsure who to vote for, there were many more of them in 2016 than in 2020. And in the final days of the 2016 campaign, a majority of those tended to opt for Trump. Now, why might that be the case? Well, C for Clinton, T for Trump. Now, whatever your personal views about Clinton and Trump respectively, you could argue, and legitimately so, that Clinton was a sort of a conventional politician. I mean, a former First Lady of the United States, a former Secretary of State, missed out to Obama for the Democratic nomination in 2008. But a consummate politician, had been on the political scene in the US for a very long time. And she was a very polarizing figure and a bit of a Marmite candidate. You loved her or you hated her. Of course, one could say the same for Trump, sort of love-hate possibilities there. But clearly Trump, while famous, I mean, he was a celebrity, or had been a celebrity, still is, arguably, in the US for many years. He was a known quantity as a known person, but an unknown quantity in terms of a politician, more specifically as a presidential candidate. And this issue of turnout. So you can perhaps see here, when we talk about population, this is the population from which the sample, hopefully the random sample, is going to be drawn. And of the few listed here, you can see one of them, and only one of the 10 or so on the screen, YouGov Yahoo, was the registered voters. So people registered to vote in an election. you can see that for the rest of the polls on screen, it's not registered voters, which was the population, but rather those deemed likely to vote, because turnout in elections is never 100%. Even in the most autocratic regimes on earth, maybe they would report a 98% turnout of voters, and the winning candidate achieves 99.99% of the vote. It's never a complete, perfect 100%. So the most recent polls are focusing primarily on their sampling population of those deemed likely to vote. Back in 2016, pollsters, who were they surveying? People that historically tended to vote in presidential elections, and turnout is never 100%. Carl, get ready, not yet, but our next question coming up soon, pre-warning for that. But in 2016, pollsters were focusing on those who had a historic record of participating in elections. And there was a minority, but a significant minority, who tend not to engage in the political process. And quite rightly, or well, it seemed a reasonable assumption at the time, that the pollsters in 2016 thought, well, if this specific person had never bothered to vote in the previous presidential elections, why would they vote in the 2016 race of Clinton versus Trump? And perhaps at the time it was a reasonable assumption. However, in practice, a few people decided to vote for the first time. And why? Well, the reason they tended not to vote is that the Democrat candidate versus the Republican candidate, didn't matter who these candidates were, people who are disengaged from the political process see no material difference between the two candidates. They are all the same. One could give the same argument about British politics. Voter turnout is never 100%, and some people do feel alienated from the political process, and they think whether it's the Conservative Party in power, the Labour Party, or a coalition, as was the case in 2010 to 2015 in the UK, their lives don't materially change, and therefore, what's the point of voting if you will see no discernible change in your lives? Well, whatever you think about Trump, he was clearly a non-conventional presidential candidate. So you've got, shall we say, the establishment figure of Clinton, and shall we say, the non-establishment figure of Trump. And whatever you thought of Trump in 2016, you may think of him now, clearly he was not your conventional candidate, such that people who would previously not bother to participate in election saw in Trump something different. And whatever your views of Trump were then, what they are now, clearly he was, at least in 2016, a different kind of presidential candidate, had never run for elected office before, or not in any sort of serious sense. And there he was on the ballot paper for to try and win the keys to the White House. And Trump did at least represent something different. Of course, something can be different in one of two ways, either different in a good way or different in a bad way. But a few people who would typically sit out elections decided that Trump, let's take a chance on Trump. And Trump's winning margin was actually razor thin in those key Midwest states, as you saw in the video there. It was barely, 80,000 votes in those three critical states, and had it gone, those votes gone to Clinton, the outcome would have been completely different. So Trump was an unknown entity in the political sphere in 2016. Clearly in 2020, he is running as the incumbent president of the United States, the incumbent POTUS, seeking a re-election. So 2020 is not a rerun of 2016. So I mentioned turnout. Most of these most recent polls that the economists are reporting, the sampling population was of those deemed likely to vote. And as we are on the theme of elections, let's have another little vote now. Carl, when you are ready, if you could flash up our next poll question. Right, now, as I'm one of these co-hosts, I can actually see these results in live time, but participants of the call won't. So I'm seeing these sort of update in real time. Okay, well, I mean, the whole question itself is about turnout. There are now 80 people eligible to vote in this particular question. Right now, I see only 65 of 80 have voted. Okay, well, let's perhaps end that polling now. Okay, so let's now share the results. Okay, share results. So hopefully, yes, you should be seeing the results now. So, I mean, the whole question was about a turnout. Just of this poll itself, 65 out of 80 participants took part in this very poll question. That in itself is a turnout of 81% response. Interesting. That once again, the audience on this call, you've chosen to join us, and thank you very much for doing so. Yet we did not receive a 100% response rate to this poll question. Okay, some of you might be tuning in on a mobile device and maybe you can't easily access the voting buttons, but nonetheless, only an 81% turnout on this particular poll question. Okay, so let's quickly examine the results. So our sample size is 65 of actual respondents. Now, of course, we know that there's some non-response, 15 of the 80s, or 19% non-response rate to this particular poll question. So for those 15 people, we don't know what their answers would be because they did not participate in the poll. So if we were to base our generalize just on those 65 respondents, there's a possibility of some non-response bias. Those 15 people, had they been able to vote, or if they were to participate now, what would they choose? So we can say the modal answer there of 70%, but not that much above the 60 and 80% figures. Okay, well, at time of speaking, I don't know what the turnout in the election is going to be, but I'm a data guy. I care about data. So the latest figures I saw from Statista, and a great website, I thoroughly endorse this one. I sign up to Statista, and every day I get in my inbox a few infographics on a whole range of subject areas. Lately, it's been with regards, of course, to the presidential election. So this is what I received in my inbox this morning. Clearly, the figures will likely have changed by now, because today is polling day. So in the dark sort of greenish color here, the early votes. So early voting is significantly up relative to the previous three elections. And the question is, why? Well, I suspect it's a combination of factors. Clearly, we are in a pandemic, which I think for most of us alive today, this is the first pandemic we have lived through. True, there have been on a smaller scale outbreaks of various viruses and diseases in recent years, Ebola, for example, SARS, MERS, but they tended to be more regionally confined. So affected lots of people, but not on a global scale, like is the case with COVID-19. So this is really unprecedented to be running a presidential election during a pandemic. So I suspect a large proportion of these 94 million early votes cast, this is nationwide, and I'm not sure what the distribution was at the individual state level, but clearly it is much higher than in recent elections. So likely to be pandemic induced. Do people really want to have to stand in line at very crowded polling stations on polling day itself? We've clearly seen a big increase in so-called mail-in ballots, or postal votes, as we would call it in the UK, mail-in ballots in the US. A large number of those. Clearly, Trump has been signaling that maybe the mail-in ballots are susceptible to fraud. Claims made. Whether there's evidence to back up those claims, perhaps a discussion perhaps for another day. So turnout is very, very high in the early stages. That suggests there are predictions that the final turnout figure is going to be a record figure, or maybe the highest turnout for at least a century, the latest predictions I've seen. So once you add in the votes from today, maybe what, 150, maybe 160 million votes may be cast in their entirety, perhaps. So, but it won't be 100% voter turnout, nor will it be 90% turnout. You will never get these things. There's always a significant minority of an electorate who still would be have that sort of voter apathy and won't want to actually bother casting their vote. Depending on, obviously, some of you are fairly young, but back in 2000, presidential election race, I remember, I wasn't that old, but I can recall it. It was Bush v. Gore, and it all boiled down to Florida. And there were reports, and at the time, it was this, almost the US was almost like a laughing stock in the world, that it was down to the election officials checking to what extent a machine had fully punched a hole through a polling, a ballot paper to actually be declared a viable vote. And the Bush v. Gore race, it boiled down to Florida. I think it was something like 550 votes, that order of magnitude, that George W. Bush, was deemed to have beaten Al Gore by. The Supreme Court intervened in 2000, and at the time, I guess people predicted that the 2000 race, we would never see anything like it again. Well, just 20 years later, which in presidential electoral cycles is not that far ahead, potentially there's a scope for a contested election result. Will that end up going to the Supreme Court? Will we have a result in a few hours' time? Will we have to wait days, weeks, possibly months? Who knows? But voter turnout, important thing. More people seem to be engaged in the election of 2020 than in previous years. Now, does that mean who's more motivated to participate? Is it the Democrats to vote Trump out? Or is it that there are many Trump supporters in the US? Either vocal Trump supporters, there's speculation of the so-called shy Trump voter effect. Namely, people who are privately supporting Trump, but not supporting Trump publicly. Now, with the anonymity of a ballot paper, you can vote for whoever you like, and no one's going to trace it back to you. But in terms of revealing your voting intention to a pollster, potentially there may be this shy Trump voter effect. Time will tell when the votes get cast and counted, then we'll be able to gain some idea. So, which population are you drawing your sample from? I think those deemed likely to vote would be the sensible choice as your sampling population, rather than your registered voters. Of course, likely to vote does not mean you're guaranteed to vote. It was seeming that I saw a poll somewhere where it was saying that the Republican supporters were more likely to vote on election day and Democratic voters were more likely to vote in advance. It's a generalization. I'm not saying all Republicans would vote today and all Democrats previously. But let's suppose you were, whichever side you supported, planning on voting today on election day. You had responded to the pollsters that, yes, I intend to vote and I intend to vote for Biden or Trump, or maybe a third party candidate. Let's not forget them. But let's say you wake up this morning with some COVID symptoms, and so you were planning to go to the voting booth, but events conspired against you such that you were intending to vote, had indicated as such to a pollster, but in the end didn't make it to the polling booths. So the population which you sample matters. So there's basically three columns to touch on in this objective of trying to obtain a representative sample. So who you are sampling. Next up is the mode. Now, this is not mode of voting. This is mode with which the opinion polls were conducted. You can see there on the screen, all of those listed says online, online, online. Let me just click see all polls. And these polls go back to February, March, so sort of pre-pandemic in the US. You can see the last or the first poll or bottom one there giving Trump a lead. But then since then, all of those polls have been given a Democrat lead, except a statistical tie for a Fox News one, although not just Fox News, perhaps the sponsor of it. But you can see sort of consistency, D for Democrats, differing margins. And I think some of these polls will be done on a national level, some will be done on more of a state level. But you can see that the vast majority have been done online, but a few are or have been phone polls. And if you think back to that little video clip earlier, saying that these polling organizations, YouGov, Ipsos, and others would tend to do most polling either online or by telephone or a mixture. So this one here would be a phone and online combination. A phone and online combination. Now, does the mode of administration of a survey matter? Well, it can. And I offer up this great example. I actually gave this example at my Sen Club talk 4 years ago, but even 4 years later, this serves as my best case study of how the contact method of a survey could influence the results of the survey. So now we're just going to briefly depart from the US presidential election, albeit we shall return to it fairly shortly. But November 2016, it was Clinton v. Trump. This was, 5 months after the UK had its main vote of the 2016 calendar year, which was the Brexit referendum. And I just want to show you one chart, which is hopefully the one you're seeing on screen here. So YouGov, a respected pollster, polls were conducted to anticipate or predict the outcome of the Brexit referendum. And I think this is an excellent case study to showcase how just the choice of mode of administration can influence the results. So just a little bit of background. The referendum, the Brexit vote, took place on June the 23rd. So these polls were conducted up to the eve of poll. Now, a referendum is slightly different from an election. You're not electing a government or a head of state. This was about whether or not the UK should remain a member of the European Union. Now, whenever you are looking at a chart, you need to be mindful of the axes and what is being plotted. Here, it's the percentage of support for leave. Now, YouGov, and in this whole article, they try and defend their methodologies and that they were saying broadly they got it right. Well, maybe, but there was some shock and dismay or disbelief about the result of the Brexit referendum, regardless of which, whether one was a leave or remain supporter. Either side, I think, was surprised by the results. And just 5 months later, perhaps on maybe a larger scale, albeit a presidential election result is just for 4 years. The Brexit, well, the actual leaving of the European Union, we've now left, albeit still in the tail end of the transition period. That's a generational thing. The UK could at some point apply to rejoin the EU, although you'd need acceptance of the EU members to readmit the UK. But clearly, if that was to ever happen, that's 20, 30, 40 years into the future. So the length of time of the impact of the Brexit vote was far longer than the 2016 Clinton-Trump race, because 4 years later, i.e. today, the Americans have a chance to either give Trump another 4 years or elect Biden instead. So the Brexit case has a far longer lasting impact. So online versus phone. And you can see, albeit, and I accept, in the last 2 or 3 days, or in the run up to the referendum, there was a convergence of the online and phone polls. But in the weeks leading up to it, you can see a fairly systematic and constant difference between the level of support for leave between those of the online polls and the phone polls. Now, that difference is of the order of about 5 to 6 percentage points, thereabouts. Now, crucially, for the referendum, the online poll trend line and the phone poll trend line, this 5-poll rolling average, crucially, these traversed that 50% threshold. Had these online polls and phone polls been down here, alternatively up here, being 5 or 6 percentage points apart, makes no practical difference to predicting the outcome. It's just because they did traverse the 50% threshold. And in the referendum, it's winner takes all. Indeed, in the US presidential election at the state level, winner takes all. You get one more vote than the other candidate in Florida, Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Some of these toss-up states can make all of the difference. So it's fact from the Brexit referendum case that the online polls were right versus the phone polls were wrong. The final result was 52% leave, 48% remain. On a turnout well below 100%. I think it was about 70% turnout in the Brexit referendum-ish. So, of course, it poses the question, why? This is showcasing that the online polls were right, the phone polls weren't, but why was that the case? And of course, what one may speculate, well, maybe online polls offer anonymity. People are more likely to give honest answers. Maybe if you're speaking to a pollster by phone, you feel the time pressure to give a more instant response and maybe don't give due thought and consideration to your response. But it turns out that the main reason why the online polls were correct was about education, in that the online polls were better able to reach a representative sample in terms of educational background. Now, I hate to generalize, one should always be careful with generalizations. It's not to say all graduates voted Remain and all non-graduates voted Leave, but by no means was it universal. But there was a tendency that the higher the educational level of the voter, they were more inclined to vote Remain. And as it turned out, education was a key predictor about which way someone would have voted in the Brexit referendum case. So just to come back now to the real-time presidential election, we are seeing a greater emphasis of the online polls. I would suggest in part because these tend to be a bit more representative, albeit not perfectly so. And in that video clip, it was saying older voters, other things equal, ceteris paribus, more likely to engage with pollsters, white voters, college-educated voters. And so polls tended to disproportionately be represented by those sort of demographic groups. Now, in 2016, the sort of pollsters learned from the errors of their ways and are claiming, and we will see in the coming days and weeks whether they are right to claim this, that they are more appropriately adjusting the weights of respondents to take into account under and overrepresented groups. Final thing, and from a very much a statistical perspective, sample size. So SC102 students are current and former, albeit current ones, we've not done the statistical inference yet. You've got those joys to look forward to in the Lent term, but we talk about N, our sample size. And you can see, okay, with perhaps ignore that sort of outlier case, that all of these opinion polls have sample sizes of the order of about 1,000, or 1,000 to 1,500. From the early votes cast, I mean, that graphic I showed you, I think said 94 million early votes cast, plus all of the votes cast today, maybe what, 150 million not likely to vote, but actual votes cast. So if we consider this as our population size, capital N, the sample size relative to the population size is tiny. Yet in matters of statistical inference, when estimating a proportion, be it the proportion of support for Biden, let's call it pi B for Biden, pi T for Trump, when estimating that parameter, sample sizes of about 1,000 will generate, for 95% confidence intervals, margins of error of about ±3 percentage points. Now, we need to drill down into some detail to see whether these are national polls or state level polls. Clearly, what really matters is not the national picture, but the state level picture. And we'll come to Q&A shortly, but I gave you some data from the Economist's forecasting model. Let's briefly look at the Financial Times. They've taken their data from 538.com or realclearpolitics.com, I forget which. And I've been monitoring this over the last few weeks, months. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to polling. And the call of who's going to win has varied quite a bit. It's mainly been sort of pro-Biden, such that most or a sufficient number of states have been called prior for Biden, such that the blue states, be they solid Democrat or leaning Democrat, there was enough of these to go way past the 270 threshold. Interestingly, just today, or the last 24 hours, this site has now thrown some doubt into the race. Now, of course, whether the media have a particular agenda or not, but if you think your candidate is definitely going to win, whichever candidate you support, maybe you're not so inclined to bother or taking the effort to go out, particularly in an era of a pandemic, and you risk your health to cast a vote if you think the result is a foregone conclusion. So, I have no idea what agenda the media may have, but by framing the election as not a clear-cut win for either candidate, can lead to further engagement of voters to think that it is important to vote because it could make a difference. So, at the state level, so for example, no one will be surprised when California is called for Biden. No one will be surprised when Tennessee is called for Trump. So, I mean, in this last few hours of polling, you would not have found Biden nor Trump in California nor Tennessee. You're not going to waste your efforts over the effectively certain states, nor are you going to waste limited campaigning time on the leaning states. You're going to be focusing on those toss-up states. Now, which states are toss-up, that has been changing by the polls in recent days and weeks. So bearing in mind that conventional opinion polls with about 1,000 sample size tends to carry a margin of error of about plus minus 3 percentage points. So all states such that the difference between the Biden and Trump figures, if it's within 5 percentage points either way, those are deemed the toss-up states where the race is too close to call. So Kansas, Utah, Montana, well over that 5% cushion for Trump. So I think those are very, very probable red states. But now you're looking at particularly Florida, Texas, really big prizes in terms of those electoral college votes. Those are going to be the real watch states in the hours which lie ahead. I noted that Michael Bloomberg, who was for a while was trying to get the Democratic nomination, it was reported he didn't get the Democratic ticket, but claims to be trying to get Trump out of office. I did read somewhere that he had pledged $100 million for the Biden campaign to be targeted just on Florida to try and turn Florida blue. Now, how effective has Bloomberg's largesse been? Well, latest figures, about a 2 percentage point lead for Biden, it seems. But again, these are all estimates. Does history repeat itself? Particularly in matters of investment and finance. In the UK, if you ever look at an advert for like an investment management company, you look at the small print and it will always say, past performance is no guarantee of future performance. Well, you can take whatever value you like out of the last two presidential elections. Nevada was blue the last in 2016, 2012. Florida, very much a sort of swing state. It can swing towards Democrat or Republican. Ohio, Iowa as well. Maine District 2, but there's just one electoral college vote for that one. So that's not a big prize, albeit maybe every vote counts. So let's play a little game. Apparently Pennsylvania Biden is leading by plus 4.9 points. So let's give Pennsylvania to Biden. Let's go with the maximum likelihood estimate. So our best guesses on the available polling data. Biden, Nebraska, District 2, just 1 vote. Nevada, 3.2. Texas, fairly historically red state. Biden's been chasing Trump quite closely. Trump has a 2.1 lead. Let's give Trump the Texas. Florida, maybe in part due to Bloomberg's $100 million assistance. Let's give, according to the polls, let's give Florida to Biden. Maine, that goes to Biden. Arizona, it's been red. John McCain, senator there, long-term senator, sadly passed away 2 or 3 years ago, very much a moderate Republican. Might there be some sort of, at the state level, more of a sympathy vote? I think Biden and McCain, fairly good pals. McCain and Trump, not good pals. So might, even though it's gone Republican, might that be a sort of more state-specific effect, which leads to Arizona going blue? We'll give North Carolina to Biden. Ohio, gosh, 0.7 percentage points. That is a statistical dead heat. It's gone for Obama, it's gone for Trump, often called the bellwether state. Whoever wins Ohio wins at the White House. Well, there are patterns, but patterns can be broken. Let's give it to Trump. Georgia, 0.2, although something which in 2012 Romney carried by nearly 8 percentage points. But according to the polls, very razor thin margin there for Georgia. And let's give Iowa to Trump, but only by 0.1 percentage points. If right, Biden's the winner. Of course, what will matter is turnout. Who wins the popular vote? Of course, it's the Electoral College that determines the winner. But will the result be contested? Will the result be contested? Now, the US is traditionally is this there's this peaceful transition of power, and if someone was to lose, an incumbent was to lose. So the last time that happened would have been what? George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. There were no riots in the street when George Bush lost. He was riding high with the first Gulf War, yet then there was a recession, kicked in sort of at the wrong time for Bush, and he lost to Clinton. There was a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, I think, which might have split the Republican vote. Well, there's no such third-party candidates to spoil the party this time round. But if Trump wins, I'm sure he will accept the result. If Trump loses, will he? If Biden wins, I'm sure he will accept the result. If Biden loses, will he? Will depend on turnout, will depend on the popular vote, will depend on winning margins in those swing states. So as of now, who's going to win? Don't know. Probabilistically, economists seems to be pretty confident, 97% or so. We will find out in the hours, potentially days, potentially weeks ahead. Okay, I think I had a sort of 50-minute speaking spot. I probably overshot by 2 or 3 minutes, but I welcome any questions from anyone.
All right, thank you, James, for the amazing talk. Just so you guys know, this session was intended to finish at 11 o'clock. So guys, please feel free if you want to go at 11. However, James has very generously offered to stay until around 11:15.
The night is young, and actually, I'm in high demand tonight, actually. And of course, obviously, there's a time difference with the US. You are my first engagement of the evening, so the night is very young for me. I am caffeined up. I've got to make it through to at least, I think, 2 or 3 a.m. So this is early for me.
So thank you very much, James. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A session. In the midst of your talk just now, there was the question in the chat. Can we model the waiting time between announcement of presidential outcomes between states using exponential or Poisson distribution?
Well, of course, the answer is yes, you can. I mean, modeling, there's no certainty with modeling. Of course, you can do anything. Question is, should you, or how much confidence should you have in these sort of modeling predictions? I mean, on a separate topic, I mean, modeling COVID. There's going to be another national lockdown here in the UK, likely starting from Thursday, albeit universities are exempt. Damn it! no. But the government has based a decision whether to lock down parts or non-essential shops, etc., based on the results of simulation models. I think Imperial, or the scientists out of Imperial, have been quite dominant in getting their simulation results out there in the media. So you can simulate, you can model anything. Question is, how accurate are these simulations? Do we trust the predictions about COVID-19 transmission rates, assuming a lockdown, no lockdown, also people following the rules? Just because there are rules doesn't mean there's 100% following of those rules. So of course you can model, simulate anything. Question is, how accurate are these things? Ideally, one would wish to do some kind of back testing to do so. Trouble is, with presidential elections, no two elections are identical. Each is a unique event. The circumstances, the candidates, it varies. 2020 is not a rerun of 2016. Trump is an incumbent. He has a record to defend, a good record or bad record. I don't wish to be a partisan. Records on the economy, handling of COVID, satisfying the conservatives with now a 6-3 majority, conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And will that have any bearing if the election makes it to the Supreme Court? So you can model anything. How good is that model? That's the question.
Thank you very much for the insightful answer, James. We have another question from Max. It is again related to statistics.
Okay.
How is Bayes' theorem used in polling? Do you have an answer for that?
How is Bayes' theorem used in polling? Bayes' theorem, we're looking at your conditional probabilities. You're updating beliefs in light of new information. We saw with the, if I may just very briefly share screen, because I think I need a sort of visual way of explaining this. Updating beliefs in light of new information. Treat this as sort of Bayes' theorem. Each individual dot will be a poll. Okay, they've been averaged out. We would expect some natural variation from one poll to another. So each of these new results, it's updating beliefs in light of the latest information. At the top, last updated 11 hours ago, when I gave the that opening polling question, I said economists had a 95% probability for Joe Biden. That was about 2 days ago, I think, when we agreed that question. It's now 97%. Why has it changed? It's changed because there's new data, new relevant data broadly from the polls to suggest that. And if I may, just one more. Finance. I know many of you may be contemplating careers in finance. Today, US stocks and treasury yields rise as Biden-Trump battle for victory. Why did they rise? Investors say markets are anticipating a Democratic win and post-election stimulus. Of course, financial markets are forward-looking, and they are pricing in a Democratic, not just Biden winning the White House, but... Carl, have you got time very quickly to do that final polling question? Because it links to this article, if we're okay. Will we get 100% turnout on this question? Okay. Now, I'm guessing participants can't see the results at this stage. I can. Okay, we're at 81%, 82, a new record of turnout in this session, 83% turnout. That's not 100%. 62 out of 74, 12 people have not voted. Oh, one has, 85, 86. Can we get, we're on 86%, 87% turnout on this question, 65 out of 74. And it seems we are done there. So even, a whole talk on polling, an engaged audience, people interested presumably in the subject matter, and we will end the polling there. Let's quickly share the results. There you go. You should be able to see them on screen. And it was, I think, 87% response rate. And just to be clear, many people are just thinking it's just the presidential election. Not at all. Everything's up for grabs. All seats in the House of Representatives, roughly a third of seats in the Senate. And so the question was, will the Democrats make a clean sweep? That means to take the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Let's just stop sharing those results and just very quickly share screen again. I love Zoom, it's great fun. There we go. So somewhere down here, where was it? There we go. Markets, financial markets, have positioned in anticipation of a victory by Mr. Biden and potentially uncertainty, but potentially a blue wave of Democrats taking the Senate and the House of Representatives. So, and based in a Bayes theorem way, why do they have this anticipation? Either based on sentiment, actual data, but it's a revision about people's beliefs. Whether these are data-driven beliefs, whether they are just gut instincts, who knows? But whenever you see changes in, well, the US stock markets today seem to be up. Okay, Biden might, if wins and gets a blue wave, maybe it might be more in the way of regulation, but you get certainty. If it's a clean sweep, Biden can pretty much do what he likes. And then you have certainty. And businesses crave certainty. Of course, there's a pandemic still to deal with, and yeah, new information. So that's your Bayes theorem, conditional probability in practice. As you gain more new relevant information, always base it on the latest things. Doesn't matter how Trump or Biden was polling back in February or March. That's not when the election was. It wasn't last week or last month. It's now. And that's what matters. And of course, the ultimate opinion poll is the actual election itself.
Thank you very much for that, James. Here's a question from Zaid. Are confidence intervals factored in when assessing vote counts, especially for closer election costs such as Brexit, where the accuracy of counting votes could be questioned?
Okay, so I mean, just to take a step back, so confidence intervals, any first year students, we've not yet covered that in ST 102. You may have seen it in sort of A levels or equivalent, but basically you're trying to estimate a parameter. In electoral terms, it's a level of support, say, for a candidate either nationwide or for the US at the state level. So you've got your point estimate, and there will be a margin of error. Sample sizes of about 1,000 will lead to margins of error of about 3 percentage points. Now, with regards to the sorry, the question was about factored in when assessing vote counts. Well, it's all an election. I say all an election is. It's simple counting votes, and I mean. In that sense, I can count on my fingers, on my toes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Clearly, there may be 150 million or so ballots to count, but the electoral officials, they will be responsible for deciding whether a vote should be counted or whether it should be rejected. Interestingly, I was reading about obviously a surge in mail-in ballots this year because of the pandemic. And apparently in the US, from what I read, that there are very precise things you need to do with a mail-in ballot to ensure that it is properly counted. So I think about 318,000, I read, mail-in ballots were rejected in 2016 nationwide. Clinton lost the White House by 80,000 votes in 3 critical states. Obviously, far more mail-in ballots this year. Projections of, I saw a prediction of 1 million mail-in ballots may be rejected because people have not used mail-in ballots before and they didn't follow the instructions sufficiently carefully. If things turn out to be a very tight race in key states, this will embolden perhaps the losing side to contest a result. But the votes themselves, upon counting, there's no uncertainty in that, albeit if you haven't properly signed the voting slip for the mail-in ones, or however they do it, or your crossing the box wasn't completely clear, then some votes were potentially may be rejected. But it's the election officials who should be independent and impartial. They will decide and adjudicate on this, such that the actual number of votes cast, albeit just simple counting, there shouldn't be any question about that. Of course, people may debate whether certain ballots should have been rejected or not. And case study for that is Bush-Gore 2000 in Florida. And for younger people in this session tonight may not recall that race well, I would suggest you do an internet search for something called hanging chads. Okay, hanging chads. Just do a search engine of that and read all about the Bush-Gore vote and how the US presidency came down to basically election officials holding up ballot papers to the light to see whether there was daylight coming through a little hole and whether a ballot should count or not.
Thank you very much, James. I think we have time for one last question. So we have one question from Jia Tian. As a follow-up to Dr. Abdey's point about how there are many models, but the real question is over how good the model is. How do we assess how good a model is?
That's a very, very good question. How to answer? I can answer it in different ways. One great thing about elections, e.g. US presidential, or votes like the Brexit referendum, a great thing about it is that sooner or later, the vote or election takes place. The votes get counted, albeit, maybe some debate about whether votes should be rejected or not. Is it ambiguous who someone has voted for? But nonetheless, I mean, take that to one side. Sooner or later, the votes are counted and we know how many votes each side or each candidate got. And hence, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back at those opinion polls and then see how right or wrong they were. In 2016, the polls were not that far off. Popular vote-wise, they were fairly accurate. Clinton won by, 2.1% or so. The polls predicted she'd win by 3.3% or something at the popular vote level. That was not far off. It was just the overall outcome was mispredicted. And clearly the pollsters would learn the lessons from failure in 2016, that they didn't sufficiently adjust for overrepresentation of older voters, white voters, college-educated voters, etc., and learn from that experience. The nice thing about polling is that on an ongoing basis, okay, we can make predictions of votes and then see after the event how right or wrong they were. And then if they are wrong, we can correct for them. Such that in non-political sampling, let's say, I don't know, you're doing a market research survey of your customers. You may have millions of customers. You're not going to do a census of them all. You take a sample of 1,000, 1,500 of them. Of course, one could learn from the accuracy of from the polling methodologies to try and see what works in situations like surveying for customer satisfaction. Noting that in those market research settings, there's never the equivalent of an election. Okay. An election, everyone who bothers to vote has their say. We see who wins. But in other matters of sampling, as you will likely see in SD 102, EC 220, EC 221, and other courses as well, typically there's only ever a sample and never the equivalent of an election. And so you can never know for sure, based purely on your sample, how right or wrong your inferences about the wider population are, hence why the uncertainties. Just perhaps another point about how good a model is. Well, what is the model designed to do? Is it to predict? Is it to forecast the future? Is it to understand the causes of things? Rerum cognoscere causas. I always like to slip that in everywhere. Regression analysis, SD 102, current year students, you've got that to look forward in Lent term, EC 220, EC 221, you're doing lots of that this year, and no doubt featuring other courses too. What's the purpose of the t-tests of your regression coefficients? Is it to predict? Maybe, but in the first instance, it's to understand. So depending what your model's trying to achieve, then that will impact how you would judge how good the model is. So for regression, perhaps you will look at your R squared. Now, those who've studied regression will know what I'm talking about. For those who haven't yet, you'll wait till Lent term. But R squared, a measure of explanatory power. Is it for predictive purposes? Well, then you do some kind of back testing and then say, well, if we had used this model to predict the in hindsight, as it were, would this model have predicted the 2016 vote sufficiently well? Or in UK, we seem to be having many general elections and referenda in the last few years, a bit of voter fatigue in the UK, and then see how good it was at predicting the past. Because the future hasn't happened yet. So the only data you've got is inevitably historic or up to the present day, so you back test. But just because a model was good at predicting what might have happened last year doesn't guarantee it will predict well going forward. Again, look at the financial adverts in the UK for investment products. Read the small print. Past performance is no guarantee of future performance. But past performance, is arguably the only way you can judge perhaps what that performance level might be.
All right, thank you very much, James, for that insightful answer. So I believe that is it for today's talk. But we would like to say a huge thank you to James and everyone who have shown up today. Just a reminder, at Sen Club, we will host weekly meetings with exceptional academics. And to keep up with the update, please follow our Facebook page, which link will be sent to the group chat right now. So yeah, next week we will have Nancy Chen from Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University to speak on her paper on foreign aid. So have a very good night, everybody. And I hope to see you all this time next week. Thank you very much. Please feel free.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy, and study hard. It's worth it in the end.
Thank you.
And take your selfies. I'm curious how that actually works. How do they take a selfie? Is it against the script? How do you do this? What do they do?
They take a selfie.
But no, I'm going to tell me. But
I know.
But you said of the event. So how is it a selfie of the event? Weird. Is it like against the screen? I don't know.
This way?
Yeah.
I must say I haven't seen anyone actually do that. So.
Oh. I'm kind of unsure how to do it.
I mean, I could right now. Oh God, it's not working.
I don't know why I'm going like this. It doesn't make any sense.
All right. Let's end this, I guess. Thank you everyone for showing up, and thank you again, James. This is amazing and very interesting.
A pleasure, a real pleasure.
Right. So should we end the meeting now? Right. So
yes.
Have a good
It's always these end of the Zoom meetings. It's like the end of a party, and you never want to be the last person to leave. Now, of course, with the Zoom meeting, of course, someone has to press the end meeting, and then it's very dramatic, and then the whole meeting ended. So I think Carl, you have the privilege of picking the end meeting thing. So at your leisure, we're gonna stay till you press the end meeting, and it's gonna be so dramatic.
James, thank you so much for coming to today's talk. We're really grateful for that. So to everyone who's listening, have a good night, and hope to see you guys next week.